Hello and welcome to another top grade video on Romeo and Juliet. We need to talk about Benvolio. Hardly anyone talks about Benvolio. Now, why is that? Well, it's mainly because Shakespeare yanks him out of the play really early on. But there's a reason for that. Benvolio represents the adult world. We can see this most clearly in the first quotation, "Part fools, you know not what you do." Benvolio is the voice of reason who wants to stop the feud. And obviously when we get to the end of the play, the feud is stopped. So if you like, the plot of the play sides exactly with Benvolio. He is the voice of maturity, even though he's a young man. Now, Benvolio walks this tightrope of being a teenager like Romeo and being an adult like the friar, who also wants to stop the feud. Now, what makes Benvolio so different from the friar is that the friar is a risk taker and he's full of arrogant hubris. He believes he can change destiny by doing something which is morally wrong, marrying Romeo and Juliet without the parents knowing. Benvolio, on the other hand, allies himself with Montague, with the adult world, with the parents. Now, Shakespeare, in our second quotation, dramatises Benvolio this way when he talks very openly to Montague and his wife about his own emotional state. He is a counterpoint, the opposite of Romeo, who, because he's also in an emotional state, hides away from his parents. He's out all night. He comes in at dawn and then he shuts himself away and closes the curtains and the shutters, refuses to see his parents. They are desperate to help, as Benvolio is, but Romeo will not take adult help on board. He is, if you like, a stereotype of a teenager. Benvolio, on the other hand, is a much more rounded persona. We find out from his own words that he has been depressed. He's woken up too early, unable to sleep, he has a troubled mind, and he's found a solution. He's gone out and sought exercise. It's actually still something doctors would prescribe because it works. Whereas Romeo, in his depressed state, he's just gone to bed and shut the curtains during the day. It's not going to work. Now we come to a really interesting bit. In our third quotation, Benvolio decides that love is an infection of the eye. So is that the adult view of the play? Does the play believe that love is an infection? Well, it does kill Romeo and Juliet, doesn't it? So one way of reading the play is that it's anti-love, or at least anti the kind of passion that Romeo and Juliet have, which they think is love. Now, in other videos, or in the guide in the link in the description below, I'll show you how we could argue that the whole play actually proposes that this isn't real love at all. It's just extreme sexual desire as a reaction against the controls put in by Capulet and the patriarchal society. I'm not going to delve deeply into that here. However, Benvolio certainly agrees that Romeo's love is not real because he calls it an infection and a poison. Now, Shakespeare deliberately chooses this language because he's going to introduce the friar, who of course is an expert in poison and medicine and reducing infection. So Benvolio also acts as a counterbalance to the friar. These are both figures from the adult world with the adult perspective. In our fourth quotation, Benvolio uses some really interesting imagery, comparing the swan of Rosaline to the metaphorical swans that Romeo will meet at the Capulet ball, who will make Rosaline look like a crow in comparison. This black and white imagery and the imagery of the crow and the swan is something that Romeo will pick up on, and so will Juliet. So she will start talking about Romeo and love as a dove, a white bird like the swan. Romeo will talk about Juliet standing out like a dove trooping amongst crows. Why does Shakespeare give Juliet and Romeo language which echoes Benvolio? Well, it's because of irony, tragic irony. It makes it appear that Benvolio sets in motion the whole tragedy by inviting Romeo to gatecrash the Capulet ball. So even though Benvolio is the most mature peacekeeper and arguably the most mature adult in the play, even though he's a teenager like Romeo, he still acts rashly by gatecrashing the ball, and that directly links to the future tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio and Tybalt, and Paris. Don't forget, he gets killed too. Now, I don't think this is to criticise Benvolio as having the arrogance of all the other characters. It's there to show us that fate, fortune is fickle. Even good people have bad things happen to them, because that is the nature of tragedy in plays. When they go to the ball, Benvolio is the man who takes charge. Even Mercutio follows what Benvolio says. He also understands the etiquette of a mask. He's saying it's not fashionable anymore for us to get dressed up and to have some guy some kid dressed up as Cupid with his bow and arrow because he's announcing all these boys who are attending the party as great lovers. He's saying the date is out for such prolixity. That's naff. It's not in fashion anymore. It's out of date. But he also uses this language of Cupid being blindfolded, but he calls it hoodwinked. And hoodwinked comes from the sport of falconry. You put a hood over your falcon so it doesn't set off and hunt before you are ready. This works with the tragic imagery of the play because love is hunting Romeo and Juliet and will kill them in the end, as we know. And this imagery of birds of prey is something, again, that Romeo and Juliet will both pick up by describing each other as falcons. Now, in this image at the very beginning, Benvolio is criticising falconry, the act of hoodwinking. And so what Shakespeare is implying is that Romeo and Juliet are both hoodwinked by love. They are both deceived by love, which takes us back to the idea that it's not actually real love, it's sexual desire and some other stuff. Just in case we haven't picked up on that imagery, Shakespeare makes Benvolio come back to it again when he's talking to Mercutio about Romeo, and he talks about Romeo's love being blind. Cupid was blind, love was supposed to be blind. Well, what did that mean? It meant that when you're in love, a kind of madness descends. You stop seeing the world as it really is. You become blind to reality. So if we take that adult view, Benvolio is arguing that if you don't fall in love, everything will be okay. You will see reality as it really is. Romeo's problem is that he doesn't understand reality as it really is. He's only interested in this kind of poetic version of what love should be like. Remember, Romeo is playing at the idea of love. It's all come from these famous poems in Shakespeare's time written by Petrarch, this Italian poet who's popularised the sonnet form, and they're all about his lady, who's called Laura, who doesn't love him. So it's unrequited love. But this becomes a pose that young male lovers in England are taking on. They're playing the role of this lover and deliberately seeking out women who reject them. Well, that's exactly what Romeo's doing. And Benvolio is saying, look, that's not just immature, it's false. That's not real life. Get a life is what he's saying. But unfortunately, he's not saying that to Romeo. He's saying it to Mercutio about Romeo. This adult perspective is developed later when Benvolio anticipates what's going to happen with Tybalt. He knows that Tybalt has written this challenge to Romeo for a duel. And he can see that Mercutio is bristling for a fight. And so he's desperate, A, to get Mercutio out of this public arena so there isn't a fight in public, because that will lead to the prince's punishment. He's also desperate to get Mercutio out of the heat, because he knows that hot days lead to more violence and more death, which is still true today. I mean, it's a fact. And thirdly, he understands what Mercutio is like and he's trying to protect him from himself. Mercutio refuses, and this is the only time in the play when we don't see him led by Benvolio. Now, perhaps Shakespeare does this to show us Mercutio's immaturity. He's not trying to show us that Benvolio's weak. He's trying to show us how the adult world is weak when faced with the extreme passions of youth. So Romeo and Juliet's extreme passion for love is mirrored by Mercutio's extreme passion for chaos, for wit, for showing off through violence and intelligence. Benvolio keeps trying. In the 8th quotation, he calls the public gaze the public haunt of men. Why does he use the word haunt? Well, the verb means to hang about. This is where men hang about. But obviously, the allusion is also to ghosts. He's effectively saying, we risk death being here, if not for ourselves, for other people. If we kill someone else, we'll also be killed. That's what the prince has said. We're going to end up as ghosts. Let's clear off. Mercutio still won't do it. And out of loyalty to Mercutio, Benvolio stays. He tries to offer Mercutio a sensible solution, which is, look, you can still have your violence, but let's just go somewhere private and do it. In our 9th quotation, Benvolio now has to take charge of Romeo, who has lost his wits having killed Tybalt. He's feeling sorry for himself. He now realises that everything's gone wrong and he's trying to blame fate. Oh, I am fortune's fool, says Romeo, which is a total lie. You know, fate hasn't made him kill Tybalt. It was entirely his choice. And that's why Shakespeare gave Romeo that soliloquy about Juliet having made him effeminate with her beauty, and now he was going to take on Valor's steel and get revenge. In other words, Shakespeare wants us to know Romeo's act was premeditated, thought through, and influenced by this patriarchal male view of what honour and bravery is. He's rejected the female view of society. Benvolio hasn't. He's still thinking about safety, and so he tries to persuade Romeo to leave. Shakespeare gives Benvolio's words more weight by making them a rhyming couplet, and I am fortune's fool is sandwiched between the couplet because they share the lines. Shakespeare often gives rhyming couplets either to endings or words of wisdom. Here, it's words of wisdom. If you go back to when the friar first appears, everything the friar says is in the shape of rhyming couplets, words of wisdom, until the friar decides to marry Romeo and Juliet, and then his couplets break down because Shakespeare's showing he's no longer wise. Benvolio, counterpoint to the friar who's trying to stop the feud in other ways. His couplet swamps Romeo's stupid objection, lying to himself that he's fortune's fool. Benvolio cuts right across that and tells him to be gone away. Quotation number 10 is also in a rhyming couplet. Shakespeare does this to give weight and authority to what Benvolio has said. He's the only character who tells the absolute truth about what happened. So if you go through line by line, he doesn't bend any of the facts to make himself look better. He tells the truth exactly as it is, and he's prepared to be killed if he's found out to be a liar. Now compare that to the friar, who doesn't say anything about telling Juliet, come on, I've got a solution, I'm going to stash you in a monastery for the rest of your life, you can live it as a nun. Now, why does the friar exclude that? Because it's dishonesty through omission. Well, he excludes it because faced with that ridiculous prospect of a life in a convent for a 13-year-old girl who's obsessed about Romeo, his audience might infer that might have contributed to Juliet's state of mind when she chose not to live. You know, they would definitely see the friar as more culpable. So the friar fudges the truth. Whereas Benvolio sticks absolutely to the truth, because Benvolio is Shakespeare's version of what the adult world should be. The friar is Shakespeare's version of what the adult world shouldn't be. And so now we have that structural point. Why does Shakespeare remove Benvolio for so much of the play? You know, why isn't it Benvolio who sees Juliet's death, who then goes to Mantua to then tell Romeo what's happened? Well, because he would be far more mature and reasonable and would stop Romeo doing what he does, buying the poison and then going to find Juliet's tomb. Shakespeare needs to remove him because who would ring me at a time like this? Let's find out.